Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today's episode is a recording of another event in the SNHU History Speakers Series, which brings professional historians, students, faculty, and staff together to talk about research projects, new publications, and history-related careers. Today's event features Kristen Engel, a soon-to-be graduate of the University of Connecticut's doctoral program. In this event, Kristen discusses her experiences as a graduate student and her dissertation research on the use of courtly spectacle in Tudor England. Let's listen in. This is the fourth event in our History Speaker Series, and today we are lucky enough to have Kristen Engel joining us. Kristen is an adjunct history instructor at Southern New Hampshire University and the Connecticut State Community College system. She is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Connecticut. Her research focuses on early Henrician spectacle, court culture, and performative politics in the early Tudor state. More broadly, she focuses on the political, cultural syncretism and interactions between the courts of late medieval and early modern Western Europe and the Southern Mediterranean regions. Her research has been awarded fellowships at the Medieval Academy of America and the Richard III Society, American branch, the Folger Shakespeare Library, and the Yukon Humanities Institute. She is currently the editor of the Court Observer for the Society of Court Studies and a guest editor for the 2025 cluster for the Royal Studies Journal titled Performative Politics During Diplomacy in the Early Modern Courts. So welcome and thank you for joining us today, Kristen.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so obviously that was a lot of information that I just covered there, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about how you got here, your academic and your professional background outside of what I just listed off there. Let us know, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, my name is Kristen Engel. Academically, I tend to go by Kristen Vitale Engel too. It just depends for my maiden name. So I started my career as a historian way back during my undergraduate career at Nazareth College. Now Nazareth University, actually, but at Nazareth College, I loved it. I had the most amazing experience at Naz. I had the most wonderful advisor, Dr. Timothy Thibodeau, who really was my mentor throughout my undergraduate career, and that made such a big difference in just how my career really sort of flew from there. I remember I started as an English major, and I took one medieval Europe history class that he was teaching, one class. And after that class was over, I wanted to switch my major to history. And he took me on as a student. And we went from there. During my undergraduate career, I had a wonderful internship at the University of Rochester, their rare manuscript room, which was so wonderful. It was such a great learning experience, and it really taught me how to deal with manuscripts and primary sources in and of themselves, etc. And then right after I graduated, I started my master's program at Providence College, where I focused on medieval and modern European history. And that was a wonderful experience as well. It was a little different at Providence because you did not have main advisors. So going from, a school where you had an advisor as an undergraduate to then just sort of having a plethora of people, to go to if you needed help, but just sort of individualized a bit was really different. But, it was a great learning experience as well. And then right from my master's, I went into, I got accepted to UConn's doctorate program. And that's where I focus on Tudor history under my now advisor, Dr. Brendan Kane, who is wonderful as well. And, throughout all of that, I started teaching sort of on the side, like part-time teaching, adjunct teaching at Manchester Community College, specifically in Connecticut, as well as Quittapahk Valley Community College. Both have been so wonderful to work with and to work for. And just recently, I was lucky enough to be hired at SNU. I believe I was hired in October of 2023. So I'm on my first real year of teaching here as well. So it's great.
I'm glad to hear it's been going great.
Yeah.
And so So that's really cool. So let's talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, we could talk a little bit about your entry into a PhD program, because I know, as we mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of students here at SNHU some in the undergrad program, but a bunch in the graduate program who are thinking about possibly going on to a PhD program after they graduate from SNHU. So what was that process like? How did you choose UConn? What was the process like? What kind of motivated you to make the decisions that you made to go there?
Yeah, so it's funny, when I was in Nazareth, so Rochester, New York, I loved it there. And I had a grand plan to stay. I wanted to stay there. I loved Rochester, everything about it. But then I really started looking at where I wanted my career to go and how I wanted to sort of specialize and what I wanted to specialize in as a historian. And that really made the decision, for me. So I knew I wanted to get my master's sort of separate from my PhD first, if that makes sense. There's tracks in doctorate programs, or I should say graduate school, where you can have sort of a master's and PhD track all in one, or you can do it separate. I decided to do it separately, just because of A, where I got accepted, and B, the type of master's program that I wanted first. So getting into Providence College, I knew that the medieval and modern history track it was almost like I double majored in a master's program, which was really interesting. So that's why I sort of started there. And then UConn was almost a no-brainer for me. I have to be honest. I really wanted to focus on Tudor history. I knew if I was going to do this is such a, wonderful, challenging, tumultuous, amazing field, that I knew if I was going to do it, I wanted to focus on something that I'm so passionate about in the historical sort of world. So I knew Tudor history was my sort of shtick, and that's what I wanted. So in really seeing on what was around, UConn and, Brendan Kane really was my top choice. I think I applied to, to a few other schools. I think it was a UMass I applied to. They're really in the New England area, but and really focusing on UConn, I actually, and this, I always say to students, if anyone ever asks, this made a very big difference for me, was getting in touch with the person who I wanted to be my advisor before I even applied. I was starting my second year, or no, it was the spring of my first year at Providence College. It was only a 2-year program, so I was going to start my second year, and that's when applications have to start going out, for the doctorate program. And I remember borderline hounding Brendan Kane via email. Hi, Dr. Kane, my name is Kristen Vitale, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really interested in Tudor history. Are you willing to take on any more students, et cetera, et cetera? And he was so lovely and kind and wrote back and forth. But, ultimately being accepted, I think that did make such a big difference in not only my acceptance, but how my sort of doctoral career has gone, and our relationship, the relationship I have with my advisor from here on out. So I think that's so crucial, is reaching out to a person you want to be hopefully, your advisor, because, if they say they're not taking on students, there's no really use in applying to that specific school. So.
Yeah, that's an important distinction between a doctoral program and pretty much any other program out there, in that for undergrad and for a lot of master's programs too, an academic advisor is usually like a full-time staff person. Like at SNHU, we have a massive, bureaucracy of academic advisors, where we've got hundreds of academic advisors, but those are full-time advisors. They're not attached to specific programs. They're there to help you navigate policies and help you schedule classes. They might be able to provide a little bit of insight into your courses, but generally the academic advisors are not specialists in history or math or accounting or whatever the field you're going into is.
Right.
But at the doctoral level, your advisor is a full-time professor, and that person is there to help you with the history part of it. They probably don't know all the policy part of it, so there are still other staff people that you would talk to if you had questions about your financial aid or whatever. You would still go talk to staff about that. But your academic advisor for a doctoral program is your one person who's going to be kind of be your champion, but also is going to be to guide you through the entire process. That person is there to help you, settle on your dissertation topic, help you find sources and all of that. And so generally you want to make sure, and that person is going to be the most important relationship of your doctoral program.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be a situation where, you're going to come in and after a semester, you're going to jump ship to a different advisor. You're not going to get shuffled around. You're assigned to that one person the entire time.
Right.
And that person has to agree to take you on. It's not like for a grad program, like at SNHU, where you get into the program and then you get assigned to an advisor. No. For a doctoral program, you get the advisor basically picks you and says, I want this person to come in and I'm going to guide this person over the next 4, 6, 8, 10 years, whatever it may be, to get through the doctoral program. And so it's a very different relationship. That's going to be, so you have to make sure that when you're going into a doctoral program that you're matching yourself with someone who you are compatible with. So it's your strategy of reaching out ahead of time and talking to the person ahead of time is smart, because you want to make sure that this person is, you don't want to end up with a jerk. You want to end up with someone who's friendly, someone who's willing, and if they're willing to take you on, even better, but you definitely want to be with someone that you can have an actual productive working relationship with for the duration of your doctoral program.
Right.
And that's challenging, but like you said, you're so in many ways, when I'm talking to students about how do you choose a PhD program, a lot of times it's pick the person you want to work with, not necessarily the school.
Right.
And that seems to be the tactic you took. I didn't go that route. I was much more clumsy about it. I applied to the schools rather than the advisor. I got lucky in that I got matched up with a really cool advisor at Ohio State, but it was pure luck that she happened to see my application in the pile. I had not reached out to her ahead of time, and she said, "Oh, this guy looks interesting," and so she brought me in, and that was really cool. But ever since then, I thought, wow, yeah, now that I know more about what that process is like, I realized I got super lucky because the normal process is you need to get in touch with an advisor first. So interesting that sounds about right. So now that you're into UConn and you're starting to take classes and all of that, and so now you've got a dissertation looming, and so how do you tell us about your dissertation? How did you get to the topic? Because the topic of your dissertation is probably the second major choice of your grad career. The first is finding an advisor, but then the second is what's your dissertation topic going to be, because that's going to consume your life for the rest of your time there. So tell us about that. How did you decide on a topic, and where did you go with it?
Sure. So at UConn, they actually do something. I'm not sure if other programs do this, but at UConn, they do something very smart, where during your first year, you take basically like a history methods class, which like my master's, I took one. As an undergrad, I took one. So I remember, being enrolled to the class, and I'm like, oh gosh, okay, I have to take another one of these. But it was actually brilliant, because by the end of sort of the double semester of the class, you have to write an innovative research paper. And many times when I was writing the paper or deciding on the topic, my advisor said, and friends would say at the same time, you want this paper ideally to be at least in some way related to an idea you have for a dissertation, or it could even be, sort of made into, like, morphed into a chapter later on to sort of save you some work and some time. But you really want to make sure that it is in line with your research. It doesn't matter if you can't, or if you can't think about, your dissertation right now because it's too early on, like, that's okay. This is not a requirement that it has to be, but ideally you'd like it to be, because it will save you some time and some effort later on. So, coming in, like I said, I knew I wanted to be a Tudor specialist, not even so much Elizabethan, more so Henry VII, Henry VIII era is really my thing. So I was like, okay, what can I do? And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but of course for me, my mind focused right on Anne Boleyn. And I remember going through multiple ideas with my advisor, and so kindly but very bluntly also, he was like, he would say things like, nope, this has been done, that's done too much, read this book that's already been done. So I was like, okay, I remember deciding, I was like, I'm kind of at a loss here. But then I found a primary source that focused on Anne Boleyn's coronation procession. And everything from there sort of just really clicked for me. And so, finding that primary source and really painstakingly going through the secondary source material, the historiography that was all out there, was really very crucial to finding that research topic and writing that paper in general. I mean, it is truly the primary source that I found for that research topic is quite literally the basis of that, which is now an entire chapter of my dissertation, is now the basis of that paper and now chapter. So it's really, really important that I found that and went through the secondary sources as well. And from there, the dissertation sort of topic just kind of fell into place with a lot of work and a lot of research, but it all sort of just lined up from there.
Yeah, that's one of the issues that we run into a lot with, even with the MA thesis / capstones here at SNHU, is that you need to contribute something new to what we know about something. You can't just rehash what other historians have already done. And so That's a big challenge, is trying to figure out, okay, if I want to do a project on Henry VIII or the American Civil War or whatever, that's a lot of reading that you have to do. You have to read basically everything you can about that topic in order to know if you have something new to say or not, because you don't want to just recreate the wheel. You have to find something new and add to our collective knowledge on the topic. And that can be difficult to do, especially for topics like Henry VIII or the Civil War or whatever that have been covered by historians for, literally hundreds of years. And so there's probably dozens, or for the Civil War, thousands of books that have been written on it, and you have to master the entire literature, and that's difficult to do. So let's hear about your topic. Tell us about Henry and Henrician spectacle and syncretism and all of this stuff that I read off at the beginning of all of this. Tell us about your topic, introduce your topic, and what's going on with it.
Sure. So, as you said, and as I've said, it really focuses specifically on the Tudor court. So Henry VII, Henry VIII. I really don't go past the English Reformation time. That's just, for the dissertation, the way it worked sort of chronologically, thematically, it just made sense for me to really end there. And I analyzed different moments of pageantry to examine how cultural constructs around Europe influence sort of the output of these large, very political, religious, spectacular moments at court. And in a broader sense, sort of going toward the syncretism, aspect, it sort of investigates the relationship between the Tudors as a form of government, right, as a parliamentary monarchy in that sense, right, and the way in which their status is really propagated to the larger English state, and even more so, the way in which the English state has taken a lot of the influence from Europe at large to really craft what it means to have a political culture in the early Tudor state. So in looking at moments of pageantry and moments of this sort of spectacular and spectacle in and of itself, it says a lot about not only cultural influences they took, but the political output of what it is that they're trying to say during these moments of spectacle. So not even just so much, coronations, which are kind of obvious, right? It's like, oh, coronation, legitimacy, etc., making into a monarch or, a queen, a king, etc. I'm talking moments of like the joust, for instance. Henry VIII jousted a lot. He's known to have loved jousting. There's a few really famous or well-known, events of him jousting. But I tend to go a little deeper than just, okay, these are great jousts. So let's look at how he jousted and, oh, he won. I look at sort of the cultural output, what he was wearing. Did he have someone out on the field with him? What pageantry did he have in sort of collaboration with the joust in general? And doing so tells us so much about not only the political messages that, Henry VIII and his sort of adherents are trying to really put out into the world, but also about the influence of Europe at broad. There's a lot of Italianate influences. There's a lot of French influences, Spanish influences with Catherine of Aragon, etc. So it just tells us a lot about sort of the whole makeup of the early Tudor court in a way that I think has been looked at by historians sort of in a vacuum, and I'm trying to ambitiously combine them together, if that makes sense.
Oh, that sounds really cool. I'm just to kind of conceptualize the way this operates. So you're talking about how they're using this spectacle, or Henry is using this spectacle to send a message. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, this is all about, even the choice of costume, the iconography on the joust stick lance. That's what it's called. I can't remember that. Yes. And so it's all about trying to send a message to try to, I assume, to project strength and to project authority.
Yeah.
And so who is he sending this message to? I imagine it would be to the people in the crowd. Yep. Does he expect the message to resonate outward from the people that are seeing him in person? Because obviously these things aren't getting recorded on video and broadcast later or anything. So what is the intent with this, and what does the process look like?
Right. A lot of the times these events that I specifically analyze are moments of diplomacy. So like international diplomacy as well. So the Field of the Cloth of Gold is just a big one in general. I mean, the amount of books, the amount of everything that has been covered by about the Field of the Cloth of Gold is just incredible. And they're incredible works. So I do use an example of that, sort of just more as if you don't talk about it as a historian focusing on this kind of thing, you're doing it wrong. You sort of need to at least mention it. So that's what I do with this specific example. But just in going off that example, we're talking about a huge diplomatic international moment. So, Henry's on sort of the scene in this moment, projecting not only to, English audiences, but as I say, French audiences, as I say, Spanish audiences. There's a lot of diplomats themselves in the audience that will then go back to their own courts and not only, write down, write primary source material that we have nowadays from that time, but sort of spread word of mouth, or even the individuals who craft other proceedings in their own sort of home courts. You can then see how they take those cultural moments and sort of make them their own. So that's a great question, though. But a lot of them are moments of diplomacy, international. That's how the word sort of spreads. And I mean, in Henry VII's case as well, we can even see that. And those actual sources and events are much harder to come by. I'm not sure if it's just a primary source material, which I suspect it is. But he also wasn't so much of a pageantry sort of king as Henry VIII was. But even Henry VIII's sort of events are very they're a combination of cultures as well.
And what are your primary sources that you're using for these? Because that's one of the issues that we run into a lot with students who want to tackle topics in, Renaissance, Reformation, but basically anything before the 18th century-ish. They run into the problem of where do we find primary sources? And so what sources are you using to analyze these spectacles?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was lucky enough just recently, actually, to have a research trip to London, and I got to, really research at the British Library. And there are a lot of coronation manuscripts that I got to look at. One specifically was the Westminster Tournament Roll, which was amazing. It was huge. This document was so large. I just couldn't take pictures of it because, they didn't allow that, which was kind of sad, but it's okay. I was able to look at it and all of those great things. But prior to actually going to London, a lot of primary sources that I used were either binded primary sources. So Hull's Chronicle is a big one. That's where a lot of my spectacle accounts came from. Hull's Chronicles. You have Hollenshen's Chronicles as well. So a lot of those sort of chronicle manuscripts or primary sources, I should say, are where I found a lot of my information. And two, reading historians who focus on spectacle in and of themselves, you then can sort of trace back a lot of their primary sources and see what they're looking at or where it is housed. I mean, one of the sources by a huge scholar in my field, Sidney Anglo, I was looking back at his research, and one of his materials was actually at the British Library that I was able to find when I was over there. So looking at other historians' works, the chronicles are really large for me. And I sort of got lucky during COVID, the time of COVID. A lot of manuscripts were digitized that I needed in London. So I was able to look at a lot of primary sources that way through sort of them being digitized because of the pandemic, but also because now, as we move forward, just as a profession, I'm noticing, the digitization of a lot of sources, which, is very helpful when you're trying to create a long-term project, like a dissertation on England when you live in Connecticut. So.
Yeah, the pandemic was rough on historians at first, but yes, since a lot of institutions, if they had the budget for it,
right,
were able to kind of redirect their efforts, even if they couldn't have people come in and look at their holdings, a lot of them were able to kind of take the opportunity to digitize sources. And so in the long run, yeah, it's actually worked out fairly well for us, even though for a while there was a lot of heartburn among historians who couldn't get to their sources. That was 2020 to 2021 was like a dark age for a lot of historians because they couldn't get to anything.
Yeah.
But things have gotten a little bit better. So that's really cool. Thank you for describing some of the sources that you're using there. And so, what is in your mind? What is the significance of this topic and the concept of the spectacles? And what's the I had instructors or professors in my grad school who liked to ask me, the so what question.
So what?
Yes. Oh God, it's just awful. But since what is kind of the significance of all this? What does it mean for those of us that don't study this era? What can we learn from all of this?
Yeah. Well, I think it's twofold, and it's so funny that so what question is something that at UConn right off the bat, so what? Why does it matter? And it is so important to think about because it's interesting how something that interests me, might not interest others in a way that contributes to our profession. And I think in being, I guess professional historian, that is something that is so important, is contributing to the field at large, right? So first, the so what for my sort of, bubble of the, late medieval, early modern world is that looking at these moments during the early Tudor court are so much more than just a pageant. It's so much more than just something pretty. It's an output of political messages of things like legitimacy, authority, strength, prowess, statecraft. These are political messages. These pageants are inherently political, and it's something that we should take into account when trying to really understand the early Tudor court and the makeup of it in general. And then second, just sort of from a much broader methodological stance, I think that we can look at moments that may seem sort of minute or just for entertainment and notice that they are not just for entertainment, that usually on a large scale, like, a court performance, or even looking at much more from the modern world, what today, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, these moments say something so much more than just a form of entertainment. They are all, in my opinion, inherently political. And it's really just uncovering the ways in which they are inherently political and what they're saying, about the person who is putting them on, or about the, the kingdom or empire, et cetera, that's really putting them on, can tell us a lot about the political culture of that time. Today as well, but.
And like I mentioned before, I'm by no means an expert on Tudor England, so I may sound ignorant when I'm asking these questions, but I'm curious because the little that I know about Henry VIII that I've picked up whenever I've had to teach like a Western civilization course or something, is of course there's the whole story about Henry VIII getting divorced and wanting a divorce, so splitting from the Catholic Church, creating the Anglican Church. I'm curious, kind of when you're talking about this spectacle and this need to project power and all of that, I'm wondering, is this part of an effort, because he's kind of creating a new, an entirely new society and because breaking from the Catholic Church and establishing a new Anglican church. That's a big deal. And so in a way, they're kind of building a whole new nation.
Hmm.
Maybe they wouldn't have called it a nation at the time, but they're building a whole new entity, political entity.
Right.
And so is a lot of this spectacle, is the intention of it to try to project stability and kind of confidence in this new endeavor, or do I have the timeline wrong
Nope.
on
No,
this?
not at
Or
all. No, you're
is it
you're right on topic, actually. That is
okay?
actually where my dissertation sort of ends. And I don't mean
Okay.
before the Reformation. I mean the last chapter and probably the conclusion, which might be an epilogue at this point, really sort of ends at, okay, we have a new queen in power, but let's look who really was arguably, and I would argue this as well, really one of the pushers for the English Reformation, right? Because of all that happened, like you said, the break with the church, etc., to get the divorce, to get the divorce from Catherine, the annulment, etc., to marry Anne Boleyn, to get a son, all of those things, and it really is so crucial to look at Anne's coronation in that moment and looking at the way in which this moment of spectacle culturally, politically differs from those previous. And it differs quite a bit. Just the way in which things are scripted, the way in which even what she's wearing. She was very pregnant during the time, but she was wearing all white. That signals things like virginity, etc. All of those sort of conflicting images are really portrayed out there. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they are indeed, as you say, trying to build sort of a new entity. And what does this mean? Well, I argue, or one of the things I look at is the way in which, if we look at Anne Boleyn's coronation, we can see in which these moments of spectacle, the output has really changed to what was before. So a large part of my dissertation too is transformation over time, which is so funny. I didn't think that would be a difficult sort of narrative to write, but writing transformation over time is very hard. It's quite a challenge because you don't want to write a you know this then that narrative, right? You want to sort of have a flow. But regardless, yes, no, you have the timeline absolutely right. And a lot of that comes at the tail end of my dissertation is talking about, we have a new queen in power. We have pretty much a new king in terms of political and religious ideology. So what does this mean when it comes to sort of that spectacular output?
Yeah, you've got a new king, new queen. You've also got a new kind of court, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the older folks had been pushed out who had been attached to the Catholic Church, and now we've
Exactly.
got a whole new generation of folks coming in with very different ideas. And so yeah, it's basically an entirely new government in a way. I'm sure there's lots of holdovers in bureaucratic positions, I'm sure, but a lot of the decision makers are new, and the kind of religious authorities are new, and so that must I've thought before about how traumatic that must have been. I mean, it's not
Right.
we a lot of times people may trivialize Henry VIII as, oh, he wanted a divorce, and so he broke ties with the Pope and set up his own thing. But you got
Right.
to figure that on the ground, that's a huge deal for people who, you've got a lot of people that are now being called upon to kind of renounce their old religious traditions and their old ways of doing things, and now embrace this new unknown thing. And I imagine that must have been hugely traumatic for kind of the little guy on the ground, so to speak.
Absolutely. It was terrifying. I mean, that was, as you say, their way of life. Now that's everything's being upended. Their everyday ritual of what they were to do is now changed. So it was incredible in the broadest use of the term.
And so I think you touched on it a little bit, but just to for kind of to zoom in a little bit, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word or not. But so you mentioned that you're talking about how the spectacles are changing over time. And so how did they change over time? What did they look like before, and what did they evolve into, and how did the messaging that came along with that change over time?
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with, and I know I keep saying this, sort of just the cultural output, right? So a lot of it has to do with the way in which, I will say, gender of the time played in, the way in which, propagating what it meant to be masculine looked like. That changed a lot. So we can even talk again about the joust, which is a great example, I think. one of the earlier jousts in Henry VIII's reign, what it meant to be, a knight, what it meant to be this figure of prowess drastically changed as we get to the 1530s. What he wore, what it meant to be, the jouster on the field, how he even interacted with some of his international counterparts, right? Earlier in his reign, it was very important that he, jousted against the other king. Like, it was incredibly important that he did that. Later in the reign, it wasn't that much important. Actually, it meant more to him to be solely on the field himself and rather have the other king, I'm thinking right now of Charles, in the stands just watching. So Henry VIII could have this sort of field all to himself. So not only in his, changing physical features, right, as we move on, as we move through his reign, this was not so much a blow to his ego, because he wouldn't, quote unquote, lose, because he would be sort of jousting against his own, right, English adherents there, of his sort of circle. But also it gave him a chance to show what it meant to be a king in 1530 versus that in, 1511 or whatnot. So very different, what it meant to be a knight, how that looked, what he wore, how he acted, the pageantry that accompanied it as well, all sort of drastically changed.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it really, I mean, I've always kind of had the vibe that this was kind of an inflection point in, English history, but it sounds like, in other, not just the trauma on the ground, but also just the messaging that the court's sending out. That's interesting. So going forward, I think you mentioned earlier that the dissertation, you've written out at least the content of it. You're still doing some revision on it and all that. So you haven't gone through the actual defense process on it yet.
Right.
But that is to come soon, I hope.
Yes. No, I hope to. I'm planning for a fall defense. I would, I just at UConn, I'm not sure if it's the same in all doctoral programs in the US, but I just solidified my 3 main advisors, and then we have 2 readers at UConn. So I just solidified a wonderful scholar from England who's going to be a reader. And then another wonderful scholar who's a reader at UConn in the English department. So that's all solidified. And the content is written. I think the only thing that isn't completely, sort of polished as of right now is the conclusion / epilogue. I'm notoriously horrible at conclusions, so that's sort of I'm waiting last second to that one. Even my bibliography is done down to the commas and the periods, but I can't get the conclusion done. But yeah, it's written now. I'm just going through it with my advisor with a fine-tooth comb, and hopefully I'm sending out the drafts to the next to the other 2 advisory committee members very, very soon, because fall's coming up quick.
Yes, it is. And so for folks in the room that aren't familiar with the process, when you write up a dissertation, that's almost the last step. But the last step is that you have to sit through what we call the defense of the dissertation, where you choose a committee of professors. You've got your primary advisor, then you usually have two other professors from the same field, history in this case, and then sounds like for you have to choose 2 outside readers. I had to choose 1, but basically you have to find a professor in a different field, basically who's completely outside of history, to also serve on your committee. You distribute the final, hopefully, final version of your dissertation to everybody on the committee. They read it, and then you all come together and spend a couple hours talking about the dissertation, where the committee asks questions. Hopefully it becomes kind of a general kind of productive conversation more than a confrontational question and answer type situation. But it can be the latter, but usually you always hope for the former, and generally it's usually the former, because most of the time your main advisor is not going to let you try to defend your dissertation if they think it's going to fail. Right. The committee wants you to succeed. The committee assumes you're going to succeed. And so it's not really as stressful as it might seem, although it is still hugely stressful, because it's kind of the big finale to your grad school program, because when you're done, you're done. At the they'll send you out of the room, and then the committee will talk amongst themselves for a few minutes, and then they will invite you back and give you their decision of yes, you are, congratulations, Dr. Engel, or sorry, we need to do this again. Generally, it's going to be the congratulations. Should be pretty rare that it would be the opposite, but that's once they come back and say congratulations, Dr. Smith, whatever, then at that point you're done and you can breathe a sigh of relief, collapse on the floor, go get a bunch of stiff drinks, and then go sleep for a week.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So it's the big finale to your to the doctoral program, and so that's great that it's coming up. Obviously we wish you the best, and I think you're going to do just fine. But what do you think is going to come next? The dreaded what's next question. Now that you've put all of your heart and soul into this project for who knows how long, the typical academic question. Well, okay, you're done with that. So what now?
What do we do now? I'm open to what's next. So I have been, and it's so funny. I don't think I've ever given my mind a break. I have always been focusing on, okay, what's next? Like years ago. I mean, I remember when I started at the community college, it was fairly early on. I think it was right after they gave me the okay to do that, right after I finished my comprehensive exams or handed in my proposal for one or the other, one of those big milestones. They were like, the UConn said, okay, sure, you can go an adjunct now. And because those milestones are big and you can't have things holding you back. So, I mean, really to me, I'm just going to keep teaching. And I have recently unlocked the importance of social media when it comes to not only expanding my scholarly network, but finding opportunities. So, the editor-in-chief of the Society of Court Studies, I found that via a posting on X, the Royal Studies Journal position. I found that, on a posting via X as well. So for me, it's just continuing on that route, still teaching at SNU, still teaching at the community college system, and, just trying to grow my career from there.
All right. Sounds good. So we are at about the 45-minute mark here, so I figure this is probably a good time to open the floor to questions. Does anybody in the room have anything to ask the soon-to-be Dr. Engel?
I was curious what the, at doctoral or just in grad school in general, what the process of narrowing down your thesis topic actually looks like. How do you get to a point where it's narrow enough that it's acceptable?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. And I think first that's a discussion, to really have between you and your advisor. Because like we said earlier, the person that you choose to be your advisor and, they choose you is very, very important in your doctorate career. And having that discussion with that person, I think is where that decision might come from. Because for me specifically, I could have, a dissertation doesn't really ever have to end. As a matter of fact, my dear friends and I have a joke that a dissertation is never truly done. I mean, you write it, it's done enough to defend, but it's never really truly done. But chronologically, for me, it made sense to have case studies and end at a certain point around the English Reformation, because that's part of my argument. But my advisor and I, prior to sort of me starting even the writing process of it a few years ago, were toying with the idea of, should we go into the Elizabethan reign as well? Would that prove, to support my argument? And I think it all comes down to what you two decide upon and what your argument really is for your entire dissertation. I have a very sort of, this is my argument, this is how far I'm willing to go with it for this project, for this dissertation, and these are the confines of what we're talking about. These are sort of the bookshelves, if you will. And for me, it was easier for it to be less than more, because the more you talk about in your dissertation, the more you have to write. So if you ever want it to be done enough to defend, you really should put some limitations on that.
Because you focus on the Tudor era, which, as you previously said, has been very, very well researched. I don't think I mean, even my sister, who knows nothing, knows who Henry VIII is.
Right.
There's been a lot of study on him. I guess how do you narrow your focus into something that hasn't been done? How do you find what hasn't been studied?
You mercilessly sort of, and I'm going to say it this way, you mercilessly sort of rip through the secondary source material. So one thing I love about being a historian is that once you have sort of your topic, I'm a historian of X, so I'm a Tudor historian, I'm an early modern European historian, like whatever, I'm an American historian, like whatever it is, you enter into this lovely little world of little, meaning like niche world of historians who sort of speak to each other in their books, in their writings, in their works. So it is your job, this is my opinion, it is your job as a historian trying to enter into that world to understand what all of those scholars who came before you are talking about, what's been said, what hasn't been said. Does it seem daunting? Yes. But to me, in my opinion, you found your niche and your specialization when you like enter the chat, if you will, and you're not afraid of going through these multitudes of books. And I mean, I think the notion that you can go through every writing, every work is just, you can't. One of my professors at UConn has actually said to me, the amount of books that you will read is hundreds, and you will get to know so many scholars through these works, but you will read this much of a world that is just so vast you can't even comprehend. But when you delve into that literature and when you delve into those, those discussions with those historians, that's when you figure out, wait a second, and you come up with your own questions about a topic that interests you.
Yeah, and in many ways, this is the difference between an undergrad program and a grad program like an MA program or a PhD program is that the grad program is focused much more on what we call historiography than it is on history. When you are an undergrad student, you're learning all the history. You take classes on, World War I, World War II, the Civil War, America since 1945, the Reformation. You take a bunch of content-specific courses where you learn a lot of the facts about the topics. So the who, what, when, where. You learn all of that, kind of the basic factual knowledge of history as an undergrad. When you go to grad school, you learn historiography, which is all about how historians study those topics. So you read a bunch of books by historians as an undergrad, but now let's talk about the books themselves and the historians themselves. How do historians actually operate? How do historians talk to each other? Like Kristen mentioned, either face-to-face or book-to-book, they talk to each other. And so historiography is something that you're going to get hammered in every course in grad school. Yes. Your first course is going to be probably titled historiography, and you're going to learn what it means to how do you critically analyze a book. As an undergrad, you're taught how to extract the facts from a book in order to construct a narrative about a topic. But in grad school, you learn, okay, how do I focus on the argument of the book and the use of sources in a book? You talk about kind of all the meta stuff about the book and the historian that wrote the book, and you're going to tear apart hundreds of books during your graduate program so that you can very quickly get to the information that you need as a grad student. Because generally when you approach a topic for a dissertation, you probably already know the overall storyline pretty well. I mean, for Henry VIII, you know all the stuff about Anne Boleyn and you know all of that stuff already, but now it's time to start talking about the historians. And so basically you don't need to read the same factual content of every book over and over and over again because you already know the factual stuff.
Right.
And so the skill that you will learn in grad school is tear apart the book, ignoring the content stuff that you already know and just focusing on what is this book adding to the knowledge? What does this book say about the topic rather than tell me about the topic?
Right.
And so Yeah, and that's really the only way you kind of figure out if you have something new to say or not, is you have to go through all the book. You have to read everything. And
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, you're not going to read 500 books cover to cover. You're going to read, you're going to skim through 500 books to get a sense of what each book kind of contributes to the topic. And then once you're done, you'll know, okay, but there is still this part of it that nobody has talked about, or
Right.
I think everybody seems to have this part wrong based on these sources, these primary sources that I found over here. And so, but now that I know that all the historians are wrong about this, you can confidently say, and now this is going to be my contribution. This is what I can say because I'm making a new argument, a new case here. If you get through all those 500 books and you realize I have nothing new to add, then it's time to move on to something else, because you can't just reinvent the wheel. You can't just redo what previous historians have done.
Yep.
It's time to move on. And so but luckily that's pretty rare. Usually when because no topic has been covered that well, usually you can find something new to add somewhere along the way. It may take more work, and it may take a lot more nuance and a lot more subtlety of your argument. But most topics you can usually find something new to say, but you do still have to do all of that legwork to start with, and that's the hard part.
Yep.
Because you don't get to do all of the fun primary source research. I mean, you can start on that, but until you know what you're actually going to be focusing on, you can't really get started. And so you're doing basically all the background reading, and the background reading can be monumental. In a grad program, you will read and analyze, read in quotation marks, but you will analyze, you will crack open, 500 or 1,000 books over the course of your grad school program.
Yeah.
To get you started, and hopefully by the end you've got a pretty good sense of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a couple of questions in the comments here. Let's see, what was the reason for choosing European history versus American history? My major is American history, but I just love history in general, so I'm kind of undecided. So, Kristen, what was your deciding factor for European versus American or any other field?
Yeah. So for me, there was really no decision when it comes to European versus an American history. I was always a European historian at heart. Even when I was an English major starting out my undergraduate career, it was focusing on like British lit. Like that was my thing. However, going forward, during my master's program specifically, I, you at Providence College, again, wonderful master's program. There was different options you could take to have a different sort of like major, if that makes sense. Not a specialization, yes, but sort of like overarching general, like what you're studying. It was American history, medieval history, modern European history. I think there was one church history. I don't remember, but there was something else. And for me, really the option came down for a split second, like between, should it be medieval or modern European history for me? So for me, it was more of like a chronological thing that way. But I just remember focusing in on what I wanted most back to when I was an undergrad. And for me, the choice was very clear. I always wanted to be a medieval or an early modern historian, a Tudor historian. So that was kind of easy. But I do think it's also what you want to get out of this profession, right? If you're looking to move forward into a graduate career, what is it that you want to do? Archive work is a really big option that a lot of I know a few of my friends who have segued into sort of archival work being their job after this. Do you want to be a history professor? Do you just want do you want to be a secondary ed high school teacher? So a lot of that could help you dictate in what direction you go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I went the American history route again, kind of like with yours, simply because that had been always my issue or my interest all along was in American history. I got my BA and my MA degrees at California State University, Sacramento, which has a faculty that was very specialized in the history of the American West. And I grew up in the American West in California and traveled extensively throughout the West. And so I had kind of always grown up with kind of this immersion in the history of the American West. And so Sac State seemed like a pretty straightforward segue for me. And so my focus was on the West in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so then when I went to Ohio State for my PhD program, I kind of carried that interest in the American West with me, and that became part of my dissertation. My kind of going back to Alex's first question about how do you narrow down a topic, when I did my MA thesis research at Sac State on California's failure to ratify the 14th Amendment back in 1868. And so my interest was in the American West, but also the West's relationship with the national government, because people who specialize in the American West, that's kind of a hot topic. Is you've got the West, which is full of people who like to proclaim that they are individuals and that they're kind of their own, they're carving out their place on the land and all of that. But the reality is that the American West is heavily subsidized by the national government, and it's very regulated by the national government. And so when I got to my time to choose my dissertation topic, kind of stuck with that theme, that we've got the West being governed by national government. I kind of focused on environmental policy as kind of the content point, and so my dissertation became the relationship between California and the federal government when it came to regulatory environmental regulations. So it kind of evolves, but it generally starts with whatever your initial interests are. And so if you are, and that doesn't mean to say that anybody is wrong if you're just a general fan of history at this point, but that could become an issue. You do want to start thinking about what exactly do I want to start specializing in as you go along. Even as an undergraduate, you're going to have a senior thesis type project, a capstone in the undergrad programs that you're going to have to write on. So it's never too soon to start thinking about what area of history do I want to focus on, what interests you the most. You can even look at the books on your shelf and see which ones. I have more books on this topic than anything else, and so maybe that's your starting point. But it is kind of essential that you do have to kind of pick, and it's really going to purely be personal preference.
Right.
What is interesting to you? What did you grow up with? Like I said, I was interested in the American West because I grew up in it, and so when I was reading books on the West, I was hearing about stuff that happened in the town, 20 miles down the road. So it was all kind of local for me. But that was my interest, and that's how I ended up there. And so everybody arrives at their topics kind of in their own way.
Yeah, and I do think too, it comes, if you think about it this way, what if you really want to make this being a historian your life, if that's your life sort of goal is to be a historian, what can you focus on every day for the rest of your life? What topic? If we're just talking about something more general, like European versus American history, thinking about in the longue durée every day for the rest of your life, what is it that you want to research?
And generally, the thing that you choose, or the general topic that you do your dissertation on, usually is going to be kind of a guiding factor for the rest of your career, simply because it's hard to start over on a new topic. It's hard to start over with that massive amount of secondary reading that we were talking about. You have to do it for your dissertation, and so a lot of people kind of tend to stick with that topic going forward, simply because they've done a lot of the legwork already. And at that point, it's just a matter of keeping up with new stuff rather than having to go back and reread everything that's been written. So, there are some historians that do like to jump from topic to topic, but a lot of times that their study may be a bit more superficial than if they had been immersed in it for longer.
Right.
Let's see. So we've got another question here. Do you plan to travel for work or stay in one place? That's kind of the eternal question for academics right there.
It is. That's a hard question for me. Particularly I've sort of made my life here in where I am, even the way in which my career being a history professor, instructor, what have you is going. A lot of my work is remote, even, the editor-in-chief position for both, for the Society for Studies or the Royal Studies Journal cluster addition, et cetera, all of those positions for me are very remote. So I am sort of trying to craft this little hybrid bubble, if you will, just internationally as well. A lot of my friends and colleagues now too live in Europe, just because it's, again, after COVID, everything is a lot more remote than it ever would have been. But traveling, is something that I love to do. I was lucky enough to go to Italy. I've been, as I said, I was did a research trip to England, and it was just amazing. And I do think that, to be a historian of late medieval, early modern, Europe in any way, shape, or form, you do need to go on frequent research trips. So, yes, I plan to travel, particularly when it comes to things like research trips, which are very exciting and fun to do. So I definitely want to do more of those in the future, near future, hopefully. I would love to go back to Florence.
That's the best part of having a international topic like that, is that you get to go on research trips to fun places.
Yeah.
My research trips lead me to like Southern California, which can be fun, but it's not nearly as exotic as saying you get to go to Florida or Florence. There was a guy I went to grad school with whose focus was on Jesuit missionaries in Peru.
Wow.
And so he got to do these cool research trips, like stumbling through the mountains of South America and all that, which he came back with some epic stories. I don't have epic stories coming back from the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. They don't have quite the same party atmosphere there as they might at 3,000 feet elevation at Machu Picchu. Alex, your hand is up again.
I have another two-part question for Professor Engel. I do want to say first, Professor Denning, how dare you say that Southern California isn't exciting as someone currently in Los Angeles? I mean, how dare you?
Hey, I'm from California, so I get it. I'm just saying, when you've got Florence on one side, and anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would greatly prefer to be in Florence versus, LA at the moment. No, anyway, Professor Engel, you were saying about advisors, how you would reach out to professors in what you wanted to study before, even applying. As someone, I'm currently trying to do that myself, and I'm finding it a little difficult because I don't know who teaches where, or if they teach at all. It's really difficult to find them. Mm-hmm. And that's the first part of my question.
Yeah, sure. So, well, my advice there would be, so are they like historians who have written like texts? Do you have people in mind specifically who you'd like to reach out to, or you're just saying, hey, I have this topic, now where do I start? Is that what you're saying?
I'm basically at that point. I have a topic I'm really interested in. I'm not entirely sure how to go about finding people who are doing the specific things I'm interested in, and if it would be better to look, because I'm gender and sexuality in the Renaissance, both in England and Italy. I know it's very broad topic. And there's no real programs in Italy for the Renaissance unless it's art history. Right. So I didn't know if it was better to look overseas at the places where these things actually happened, or if I should focus more in America. And how do I find them?
Right. No, that's a great question. That's a great topic too, by the way. A lot of my research sort of coincides with the Renaissance, England Renaissance piece. So that's a wonderful topic. I love that. No, I would say that it's first, the overseas piece is up to you. If you would be willing to do, a graduate program overseas, that's all up to you. I remember even, back when I was an undergrad, I even did some looking for overseas, graduate programs as well. In England specifically, they have some wonderful programs. I think though, what I would say is, personally, this is where I would start with the secondary sources again. So the historiography piece on it. So if you're researching, gender and sexuality in the Renaissance, what specific texts have you started looking at? And then look at the authors from there. And then what you could also do is look at bibliographies as well, looking at the secondary sources that those historians have used. who are the historians writing those? And that helps as well. You could also go the route of sort of, via the internet, looking up, even if you wanted to type in something so generic as Renaissance history graduate programs in X, in, California, in Italy, in Minnesota, wherever it is that you are like, okay, that might help you as well. And then a lot of the times, if you find a program that, okay, this is a great Renaissance graduate program, you can look at, there's usually a page that says faculty. You click on the faculty and you can sort of go from there. Sometimes it's a matter of like elimination. Other times it's, finding those historians via books. For me, it was, I want to be a Tudor historian. Brendan Kane was someone who I had read his work. And even though he's not specific, like he is, but he focuses more on Ireland and Elizabethan. But, I knew like around the Yukon area was where I wanted as well. So I reached out to him first. And if he was interested to take somebody on who focuses earlier in the Tudor reign, right? Not so much Ireland or Elizabethan Ireland, but, focusing really on early English Tudor historians, like, would you be willing to do that? So sometimes it's not even exactly like the same thing that your advisor does. It would just be the advisor is an expert on this area. Yes, they're willing to take you on. This project sounds interesting as well. So there's a few different ways you can go about it, Alex. But that is a good question. I mean, how do you find these places? That's a great question. But like I said, though, too, I mean, Italy itself, I don't know about programs in Italy too. And also if you can speak Italian, I mean, that would probably help in Italy. But I know England, you could check out the programs in England if you're willing to go there. They have a lot of great programs.
I speak very bad Italian. I'm a better reader than I am a speaker.
All right, hey, well that'll still serve you well later. Yeah, that'll serve you well later when the research comes.
Yeah, I just didn't know if it would be easier to look internationally where these events actually happened and where the sources are to, access them easier, or if it would be better to, stay in America where people speak English and I don't have to struggle.
Right. And then honestly, that's really just a personal question for you. I mean, do I wish I lived in England? Like, absolutely. When I went there, when I did my trip to London, my mind was blown. I was texting my husband. I was saying, I don't want to come home. I love it here. This is amazing. But.
Oh, yeah, no, really, the only reason I came back from Italy is because I have cats.
Yeah, right. Things holding us here. The best sort of things holding us here, though. So, yeah, but it is also, it's all a personal preference. If you're willing to make that jump, then you can go ahead too and just email people. Emailing people, there's no harm in doing that. And if they say, okay, what's the person going to say? No, I can't take you on, or no, I don't want to specialize in that. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would second the idea of, the books that you're reading for your background reading for your topic, find the authors and see where they teach. Most of them are teachers.
Well, unfortunately, most of them are dead. So,
well, that's a problem. But again, you can. One thing that you can do also that just occurred to me is if you go into like JSTOR or something and you just type in the topic, you'll probably find people who reviewed some of the books that you're looking at, or you'll find it's really helpful when a historian decides to write a historiographical essay on a topic where they basically summarize the existing literature on a topic, and then you could. So, this will be someone who's writing later than the books were published. And so maybe there's a more recent historian who published an article than the ones that published those books who are dead. There may be some younger historian who's just starting out publishing articles or historiographical essays or lengthy book reviews. That might be a way to kind of find some folks. You'll find some that'll help you find more junior faculty who are in the field. And also, another thing that Kristen mentioned is that you're not necessarily going to find the perfect advisor who happens to know everything there is about, gender in Renaissance Italy. But you want someone who can help guide you to where you want to be. My advisor doesn't do anything about the American West.
Right.
My advisor at Ohio State when I was working on my PhD didn't do anything with the American West, but she does know the ins and outs of the national government bureaucracy and all of that stuff, and so she was able to kind of guide me from that angle. I was kind of on my own for the American West part of it, but so be it. But that was the part that I was stronger on anyway, and so.
Right.
You're never going to find the perfect advisor. It's just a matter of finding people whose work is close enough to where you want to go that you think that person can help you get to where you want to go. And that can be tricky, but it's it's don't toss don't discard names simply because they don't check all of the boxes. You want to look
Right.
for people that are just checking some of the boxes that can get you where you want to be.
Thank you. No, that's brilliant. I didn't even think of reading historiographical reviews, so thank you.
Yeah, let them do that work for you. If you can find a good historiographical essay, that will save you having to do a lot of that reading because they've done it for you, and so they can at least illuminate the trends in the field and kind of the debates and all of that. So use those as much as you can. Let's see, we've got another question in the text here. I changed my major to BA Creative Writing Screenplay. If I want to write a story about the West, would I have to ask a historian for more background information? I guess that's a question for me. I think if you are approaching it from a non-academic perspective, it may be useful to interview some historians on the American West, because if you're not doing the full-on academic, you're not writing an academic monograph, then you don't necessarily have to do all of that historiographical background reading that I was talking about earlier. You don't have to go tear apart the 500 books on the history of the American West, because you're going the narrative route. You're going basically you want to know the who, what, when, where, that type of thing, and that type of stuff is more easily accessible by reading. Just figure out what are the most well-regarded books on the history of the American West, or whatever topic you want to write on, and just kind of start reading those. It may help to reach out to a historian if you have specific questions. I mean, if you were to contact me and say, hey, I want to know more about the American West, that's an 18-part lecture that, I could spend an entire semester teaching you about. So let's focus the question a bit. What exactly do you want to know? So if you're just starting out and you want to just kind of understand the general context of the American West, you'll probably be fine just reading some of the larger, there's some textbooks on the history of the American West. There's some kind of synthesis, kind of, find some of the big books on the history of the American West and just read through those. That'll give you a lot of the context that you would need. The level of detailed knowledge about the West is really going to depend on your story. What are you trying to do? If your storyline is about, somebody who's laying tracks for the railroad, and that person is doing this specific function on the railroad, then yeah, you're going to have to read a lot about the railroad, but you're not going to have to read as much about, water allocation in the West. So it really depends on what your topic is. And probably my best advice is always start broad, find one of the textbooks on the topic, read through that so you have a general understanding of the context, and then as your story evolves, you could then start focusing. You could find the book that focuses on the intricacies of laying railroad track in the American West, because it's out there, and then you can just kind of go from there. But yeah, I mean, that's basically, if you're going to be writing historical fiction, you're setting yourself up for doing a lot of that legwork, that background reading to establish the historical context. Just like somebody who's writing a book on, current events. I mean, you're still bringing in a lot of the context of the current world. It's just that you know it because you live there, so you don't really have to go out and look for it like you would for historical. But yeah, so whether you want to do it from a book or ask a historian, I mean, either way is fine. If you ask a historian, though, again, you'll probably want to focus on what exactly do you want to know, rather than expect that person to walk you through the entire history of everything, because that could be a pretty lengthy endeavor. I think we can probably call it a day. So this was a lot of fun. Thank you for joining us today, Kristen, soon to be Dr. Engel. And thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thank you so much. I loved it.
I do kind of remind everybody that our next event in this series is going to be on September 5th, where Will McLean Greeley is going to be talking about his book, which is called A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. So keep an eye out for the registration link for that, and I look forward to seeing everybody again there. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
And thank you all out there for listening. As I mentioned earlier, our next History Speakers event will come on September 5th, 2024, when Will McLean Greeley will discuss his new book, A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. Stay tuned for that. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please send us a message to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For Kristen Engel, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.